All right. Thanks y'all for being here. Marshall, I scheduled this meeting after you left some comments on an issue about tasks, and I just thought it'd be easier to talk synchronously and also selfishly. The questions you're asking are ones that we've been asked by others, so I thought it would be helpful to talk about it on YouTube, and record it so that we can share this out with other people when they have similar questions.
Yeah, that
So
sounds
I'll
good.
let Gabe do most of the talking here, and I'll jump in as needed. I
And
copied some of the things from the issue onto the agenda.
yeah, this looks good. The I want to preface everything by like the most important thing that I want to understand is just like the overall direction of work items, because like I thought I understood where we were headed with all of that, and the um the subtasks on issues seem to be like different from the overarching direction that I thought we were headed with work items. So it was like that sort of juxtaposition that that I want to understand better, because like the direction I thought we were headed with work items was that rather than having all of these discrete entities that are sort of based on this issuable markdown description model, right? That we were going to have one overarching entity called a work item with various implementations of that in the form of epics, issues, incidents, alerts, all that stuff that's sort of based on that issuable model today. Um, but then when I saw the tasks effort, it seemed to deviate in the sense that like it's not a full-blown issue, right? Or at least in this current iteration, it doesn't have all the metadata associated with it, labels, assignees, a status in the same way. And so it seemed like a departure from a work item rather than a step in that direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. So rebuild front end for real time /. I think it might be helpful to start with where we're going is exactly what you said. So there's not any difference there. The reason why tasks don't look like issues and don't look like epics is because we sort of had to figure out how to do a lot of things, sort of sequence a lot of different things in a way that allowed us to be iterative to reach that ideal end state. And so one of the things that we want to do with work items is make them so that they're extensible. And by that I mean not just like where our teams are hard coding the behaviors, right, for these different things, but it's like actually a framework that we can then expose to the end customer to say like, hey, you want to use work items for these use cases, and you can install these apps or these widgets, and you can turn them on and off. And like to do that, to kind of reach that ideal end state, we sort of have to have a different API than we have for issues.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to figure out how do we write incrementally and iteratively, like write this new API that supports the extensibility we want. How do we also build a new front end? We would either have to refactor the existing issue front end, because right now the tech that's powering that is super fragmented and all over the place. Like we have a bunch of Haml stuff, we have a bunch of like older view stuff, we have a bunch of newer view stuff, we have a bunch of Apollo GraphQL stuff. There's no standard set of APIs that's powering a single view. There's no way to even get all of the system events at a single API endpoint right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and so we sort of have to pay down that technical debt, and along with that, some product debt, right? Because if we think about extensibility, the sidebar and the way the issue layout and all that stuff, it's not scalable and it just like doesn't work. And so
Right.
we have to figure out a UX pattern that supports like use cases. Like we're on incidents, there's the different tabs. On epics, there's a couple different tabs. Tabs aren't necessarily in themselves scalable. Like, so what's the interaction model look like for these more complex, like we're calling them apps or whatever, or widgets that can be embedded and enabled for work items. And then you have the, how do we unify the data model to get like epics migrated onto the issue data model, which is the future work item data model. How do we do that? Like, because we would have to then add parent-child relationships to the issue data model. Then we have to add issues, make issues available natively at the group level. So like all of these like are sort of like moving parts that we had to take into account. And so the kind of put it point blank, right now the task is a work item. Work items are powered by the issue data model. So you could theoretically add in, and we've disabled tasks from the REST API for right now. You could, via the API, add an assignee to a task, or previously before we disabled that. And I think what our plan is as we sort of build and refactor each of these widgets within the new API for work items, we're not like, we also have to do some model splitting, things like that, to support the extensibility at some point, but we've kind of deferred that a little bit. We're slowly going to enable these things for tasks. Then once we have parity with what is now at the epic level, so discussions and notes and labels, and then issues are also natively available groups, we're going to migrate epics to using work items. So both tasks and epics would use the same UI. And then when we get parity with issues, we're going to migrate issues to be a type of work item, which it sort of already is behind the scenes.
Right. So the like having a parent-child relationship on work items, which is a prerequisite to having epics and issues based on work items, right? That's to me seems like the same thing as tasks, right? The only difference being that like we define a parent-child relationship between work items as an epic is the parent and issues are the children. So I guess I don't understand, like, in that future state where you can define a parent-child relationship between work items, what is the role of a task, and how is that different from a simple parent-child relationship between work items?
It's not different. It's the same thing. So, but if you think about in the future too, where sort of task, or I guess work item types are user defined, right? So we're going to ship with a default like hierarchy based on what we heard from customers, where that might be, you know, capability or theme, capability, epic, feature, user story, and then task, right? That's the most common we hear, which maps saved. And that's all sort of what we're doing is right now we're hard coding the type task as the lowest child, but in the future, people can rename that to whatever they want. They can name it food, they can name it bar. And then when you get into multi-level epics, right now, the confusion comes in the fact that you can't have specific types on those. So it's almost like we tell customers right now, okay, well, if you want this, then you have to use the lowest level epic is your story and then use your issues as tasks. We're sort of like making that so you don't have to do it and you don't have to split that across a group in a project, because most of the time the team that writes the stories also breaks it down into tasks, which usually happen within the same project, but sometimes not, if that makes sense. So all a task is a hard-coded lightweight parent-child relationship, and it's the same thing, the same mechanism that we're going to use for epics to be type issue, you know.
I think that makes sense. Like I really like the direction that GitHub is going with their plan tooling, and that is in alignment with what they're doing, right? Like they don't have a concept of epics. They're creating hierarchical structures with based on a flat list of issues, essentially, right?
Yep.
And like the next step for them is to allow like their project planning thing to support those parent-child relationships between issues. And so like that makes a ton of sense to me, because people, like, I think the problem that people have with epics is that the term epic doesn't map to some concept within their organization, right?
Correct.
Which is why having just one primitive type that everything is implemented on, like, organizations can define what a root level object means to them, right? Like it can be an OKR and then they can have all their KRs underneath that, right? But everything's just an issue.
Yeah, yeah. And the reason why we went with the name work item is that when we talk to some customers, they have issues with term issue.
Sure.
They don't like it. And then also as we migrate, it feels weird to say that like epic is a type of issue. And so instead of I guess like a task being a relationship type in our world, like a task is just a work item type. And then you can define the relationships between your different work item types and saying this is a parent-child relationship type, like, and then you can kind of build out whatever reporting hierarchy you want. And we'll of course ship with defaults. Like we might even have a GitLab default, right? And we might have a safe default or whatever that maps these methodologies. So when people onboard to GitLab, they're like, this is a process we're following, and they can do a single click, like get everything generated and started out really easy. But then they have the controls to go in and kind of tweak some of the knobs and dials as they see fit. But it is all based on the same primitive, right? Object.
Yeah.
So
I actually am really interested to see where GitHub is going, if they're gonna formally define types instead of having everything be an issue. Because that's something we hear very often from customers. Like they want to be able to just quickly filter on like these objects are this, they have these properties on them. And this is like, for example, a product manager only looks at features. They don't necessarily care that much about like tasks, right? That's not really something that's relevant to them. So they want to be able to filter all that out so that it's not sort of like quote unquote in the way when they're trying to do a specific task. So I am really curious about where they go. So that's something that I'm sort of watching with
Yeah,
them.
it would surprise me if they like are opinionated at all regarding the types of issues. I completely expect that they're going to leave that entirely in user land, because the like they have this distinction that we don't have between a repository and a project plan, right? Like they have this whole top level concept of a project, which is how like one or more repositories get rolled into. I mean, it's sort of analogous to like our hierarchical group structures, right? But I suspect they're going to keep pure issues at the repository level, and then whatever like whatever you want to do at the project level, like however you want to organize those issues into higher level constructs. I
that's
doubt they would introduce any new concepts at the repo level.
yeah, that's one of the I would say differentiators that we have right now that's interesting, that why we do get larger organizations that want to use GitLab Plan instead of GitHub, because of the hierarchy, and it has like these crazy inherent complexities that come with it. So I'm interested to see how they solve that too. And so I think in the future, I sort of see us moving towards a sort of a model where we also have the same flexibility. Like right now, issues only live at project level and epics only live at the group level. But like work items live at namespaces, and they can be related, have some form of relationship to other work items in any other namespace, right? And so that way you can go across your different ways that you want to organize things, and even have one thing show up in multiple places in a more formalized way.
Yeah. And
So
I think having issues at the group level will be huge too.
yeah, we
Because that's
started on
always
that.
seemed like an arbitrary thing, right? Because like it's just totally dependent on like how you're doing like your project management, right? Like whether
Mhm.
you have like a separate issues only like project in that group versus issues in every project versus like only using epics. You know what I mean? Like there's been a bunch of ways to work around that, but nothing quite as clean as just doing whatever you want at the group level.
I agree. Yeah, it was an arbitrary decision, and that's sort of where, like, I wish we had never built epics. Honestly, I wish we'd never built groups. Also, so we're trying to like reverse some of that and go back to the simpler ways and learn as we go. I think also just to speak to some of your questions and your comments that I read about, like, well, why are we going with the widget instead of just Markdown? We started the Markdown route, and then as we went, it sort of got more and more complex. in terms of like how you do the syncing, and then also what the user experience is like and discoverability. Like I think it's great for existing GitLab users who might want to just convert an existing checkdown list item into like a task, and have it be a first class thing. But then you quickly get into the syncing problem of what happens if you edit the description and remove the reference to the task, then it's sort of like lost. And you have to go find it from the issue list. And then what happens if you like interject a bunch of text in between the references in the markdown? How does that impact the syncing? And those are all things I think we can work through. But it also, I think we just made a decision to keep things simple. We're not going to remove that functionality. We just disable it behind a feature flag until we can work out a lot of the nuances. But what ends up happening, and I think people added somebody added the lightweight tasks like for Markdown and put that and treat that as like a first class thing in the API to a certain degree in terms of tracking. And we slowly want to like remove that and kind of relying on the Markdown checklist task numbering is your progress, and rely more on the formal parent-child relationship items as the things that you're tracking to report on progress completion for the parent.
Yeah, I am curious how, like, what I'm not sure about with the GitHub implementation is like what happens if, like, if you're looking at a task that is related to a parent issue, right? Can you remove that relationship from the at the task level, right? And if so, what does that mean for like the markdown checklist in that parent issue? Um,
Right
because
now, the way that they have it, it's not a formal relationship. It's more of a reference. It's kind of the equivalent of us kind of like putting an issue in the description. There's some lightweight like progress reporting, but it's not as formal of a relationship as I think our customers would expect based on the precedent also that we have with epics and issues, right? Where it's like it is a very tightly coupled parent-child relationship.
yeah, well, I know they're working on like discrete parent-child relationships, so it'll be interesting to see how they map the markdown thing to that. But certainly, like when it's definitely like a bidirectional relationship. Like the task issue in GitHub is aware of the fact that it's associated with a parent issue. You know what I mean? Um, and I think like that syncing of the checkboxes based on the status is like one of those features that I've wanted in both GitHub and GitLab for like 6 years. You know what I mean? Like I think there's a ton of value in that working the way that people would expect it to work, even if there's like caveats. Um, but like I don't have a good answer for how it maps back to the more formal relationship. Um, but along those lines, like another point of confusion from my perspective was that this was introduced as like a completely separate widget when we already have like a widget that's responsible for the relationships between issues and merge requests and whatnot. Um, but like I it just felt odd that we didn't just call that a parent-child relationship between issues. You know what I mean? Because like I find the whole experience of like what a task is right now more complicated than if they were just both represented as issues, regardless of all the markdown stuff. You know what I mean? Like if we had just introduced a new parent-child relationship and we had said that this issue relates to this issue because this one is a parent and this one's a child, right? And you can show that in both on the parent and the child side. I feel like everybody would have been like there would have been a lot less pushback to that approach because that is directly in alignment with what my understanding of the future plans are, right? To be fair, I don't know like what you all are thinking in terms of like relating issues together versus like relating our hard-coded epic concept to an issue, right? But I suspect we're just trying to like get rid of all the distinctions over time, right? Like if somebody wants to associate an issue with an issue, we're not going to stop them from doing that just because this thing's called an issue, not an epic, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I think I wish, I mean, I think that it makes sense to put them in the same widget. That wasn't my decision. Um, I think there's room to improve on that because to me it is just a different relationship type to everything else where you have blocking blocked, and I don't think you should be able to have a linked issue or a linked work item also be a parent work item, which right now you can do. So I'll leave that in Melissa's court. That's her area of responsibility.
Yeah, there's a lot of content. I actually looked. One is like I looked overall in the industry, like what people are doing. There's both implementations where they're like separate and together sort of thing. But I think also if you think about a blocking relationship, a related relationship, they're very different. They're not hierarchical, right? It's just like you're pointing from one thing to another. Versus a parent-child relationship is very different, right? There's a lot of more nuance and enforcement that has to go along with that. Like we even discussed in the back end, are they together or different? And they're separate. They're not treated as the same just because there's a lot more complexity and rules around a hierarchy versus kind of relating, which is just sort of pointing to each other. So that's why they're separate as far as the UI goes. I think that's definitely something that we can iterate on, right? And I would say I'll point you to the latest version of this in our test stage, so you can give us feedback on what you see there, because we're still working through a lot of the UX stuff on this. And I do want you to see the latest and give us feedback on that and tell me if that's more clear.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, the main thing, like, I think whether it's a separate widget or the same widget, like that's an easy change. But I think we should definitely surface tasks as issues, right? Like I don't think there's any value that's added by hiding the fact that those tasks are essentially issues on that repository, right? Because like I don't want to have to go and find the parent to then find the task that I'm looking for, right? Like I think most people are just going to want to search a flat list of everything, right?
Yeah.
Find either
And
the task or the issue that they're looking for, and then
you can do that now. I think hopefully I've been on vacation and I just got back, but they were working on making tasks show up in the issue list and be filterable there and all that stuff. The only thing we're sort of putting an artificial constraint on is what data we show, because we're trying to build out the new API and then the UI at the same time and make some changes to usability there. So we need some form or place to do that incrementally and iteratively. Otherwise, like if we would have split it out just at the parent-child relationship and then tackled the UI and the API later, we'd have to put that behind a super, super long-lived feature flag and only enable the new UI when it had complete parity with the old UI. And so since we're introducing this new concept of a child to an issue, which is a task, which is the same thing as an issue, if you could think about that at work item, we're sort of gating what data can be added when, so that we can build out compatibility with the legacy issue UI, if that makes sense. But in a new way.
Yeah.
But I also think like if you look at what a task is, like a task is supposed to be something that's like a couple of hours of work, right? Like if you look at the agile frameworks, and if you look at tools out there, like they are very simplistic, right? So it's, I think by design, not going to be exactly the same as an issue or an epic. But in the future, like you said, if somebody wants to like point issues to each other, they can, right? Like that is something that will enable. But we will intentionally have objects that are different with different capabilities on them that map to specific jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I think any constraints like that seem too opinionated from my perspective, because I feel like I feel like as an end user, I should be able to abuse this however I want to, right? And like I might have a different definition of what a task is, right? Like I would find like the relationship, parent-child relationship between issues really valuable if it weren't constrained, right? Like the fact that it is constrained. I I don't know. Like I think that like I think where the value would be is like when we get to the state that's more like the current epic to issue relationship, like where epics can inherit properties of their um, aggregate issues that are associated with them, right? Like I think the parent-child relationship between issues could be powerful in the sense that like I can define metadata at the top level issue and have it automatically propagate down to the child tasks that are associated with it, right? So like if I label an issue and that issue has children, that label cascades down to all the other children, which is sort of like the opposite of what we do with epics today, I
That's
think.
this is one of the reasons why we're doing all this on the issue data model and rebuilding it a little bit at a time, because we're building the proper cascading is, it's not inheritance up, it's cascading down, and then also how things roll up, and making that work the way that it should and not sort of backwards how it works
Yeah,
now.
and I think for organizations, like depending on the direction that you cascade, whether it's up or down, like that gives you a ton of flexibility for using that same thing as either a task or more like uh, an epic, right? Like
Mhm.
cascading down sounds like a task, cascading up sounds like an epic, right? And I think
Yep.
that's good that both those could be modeled the same way. And to me, is a case for why we shouldn't introduce like the artificial constraints, because just let people use it however they want to.
Yeah, so we're over time, but I did want to end in like I think in the end state will be somewhere where like your use case will be met. We're gonna be kind of like more opinionated in the front end, I will call it, but in the back end, it will like what we're building will be able to like mix and match and basically use the system however you want. Some of that stuff maybe in higher tiers for kind of like giving you that configuration. But I will say that like our customers want us to be more opinionated, right? Like right now, the flexibility with epics and like nesting is confusing. So they want things to be more like defined and labeled in specific ways, right? And that's what we're taking as sort of like the out of the box default. But we will build the system in a way that it can be configured to change depending on like different people's workflows.
Cool. And oh, I want to be respectful of time, but just the last thing I'm curious about is like another thing that I like about GitHub projects is the way they're enabling like different teams to basically have different views of reality, right? Like because the custom metadata that they allow you to associate with what they call like project items, I think, is on a per project basis. Everybody's looking at like the same set of issues, right? But different teams might have different custom metadata associated with that. And I was curious if we'd put any thought into like what that might look like in GitLab, or if we see value in that approach.
Yeah. So I'll link this as under 6. I've spent probably a better part of a year trying to figure out how this is going to work in GitLab. And I think I figured it out with the help of some engineers, of course. They were very smart about it. We're sort of building in a new sharing model. And the complexity here is that we also want to figure out how this plays in with the work that Workspaces is doing and how they're going to rebuild. Sort of like right now we have a really bad problem with how things inherit down and flow up, and it's not consistent across different objects. And then there's not consistency between how our group project hierarchy works and how group sharing works when you give access and permissions via group sharing. So those two things, like, and this is Workspaces domain, but those two things need to become the same mechanism, sort of like what we're doing with efficacy issues, which I think they're aware of. And depending on how that works out, we sort of want to either take what they've built there and apply it to resource specific things instead of like a namespace. You can share a work item with multiple different groups or projects, and then they all show up there. And depending on what access controls you have to the different projects. It determines what visibility you have for the metadata that is basically associated to that work item. So I think we know how it's going to work. We just need to build it, and we haven't started building it until we have the consolidated work item, because if we were to do this, we'd have to do this build this like same mechanism for issues, and then for epics, and then for requirements. And so we're trying to like get that primitive and consistent thing down. And once we have that, then it sort of makes more sense to take on the work for kind of making a work item kind of extend across multiple namespaces, because that sort of already happens right now. It's just not official, right? So like an issue can bubble up to a parent group. You can associate a label from that parent group to that issue. If I don't have access to that parent group, then I don't think I see the label on my child issue.
Right,
It's just
right.
not formalized in a way. And so what I've written down in this proposal is a mechanism that we have to build to make it more formal, if that makes sense. So it would work very similar to what GitHub does now. And I actually modeled a lot of this off of Asana before GitHub did what they did with their projects beta. So
Cool.
All right, I'm gonna stop the recording because we have to go.
Yeah, thank
We
you all.
can schedule a follow-up.
No,
Thanks, Marshall.
This is great. I really appreciate it. I'll
Yeah,
let
keep
you
it
know.
coming. Appreciate
Thanks.
it.
Bye.